On my birthday, my billionaire grandpa smiled and asked, "Is the apartment comfortable?" I never thought my 27th birthday would split my life in two. One version before that night and one after. We were sitting in this ridiculously fancy restaurant downtown, the kind of place where the menu doesn't even bother listing prices. My parents insisted on it, saying a milestone birthday deserved something special. I already felt out of place in my simple black dress, while my mom sparkled in designer jewelry I'd never seen before, and my dad wore cufflinks that looked like they belonged on a movie villain. But first, hit that like, subscribe, and notification button so that you don't miss more stories like this. I was halfway through my entree when everything stopped. The room shifted. People at nearby tables sat straighter. Waiters started moving faster. That's when I saw him, my grandfather, Edward, 82 years old, sharp as a blade, billionaire real estate mogul, and honestly the last person I expected to show up. He walked straight past my parents, right to me, kissed my cheek, told me happy birthday, sat down beside me like the head of the table had been waiting for him. My parents froze, pretending to smile, but I could feel the fear rolling off them. Then he looked at me and said, calm as anything, "I hope the apartment is comfortable." I laughed awkwardly. "What apartment?" Silence, the kind that makes your stomach drop. My parents went pale. My mom's fork clattered against her plate. Edward's eyes hardened, even though his voice stayed calm. "You don't know about the apartment?" I shook my head. He turned his gaze on my parents. "Then where did the money go?" It was like a bomb went off at the table. My dad's throat worked, but no words came out. My mom looked like she might be sick. The entire restaurant was staring now, and I couldn't breathe. Money? Apartment? None of it made sense. Edward signaled to his assistant Leah, who was already tapping notes into a tablet. "Book us a private room and call Stanley." His lawyer. His tone left no room for discussion. Minutes later, we were led into this dim, wood-paneled dining room, meant for 12, but suffocating with just the 5 of us. Edward at the head, me beside him, my parents across, looking cornered, Leah by the door, tablet ready, and then Stanley arrived, briefcase in hand. Edward folded his hands. "Explain?" Stanley adjusted his glasses, opened the case, and pulled out documents. His voice was matter of fact, like he'd done this 100 times. "When Maya was born, a trust was established in her name, $5 million initially, managed by her parents until her 25th birthday, at which point full control was to transfer to her." I felt the blood drain from my face. $5 million? Stanley continued, "The trust has grown, or rather, it should have grown. As of the last statement, the value was—" I almost laughed. It was so surreal. $8 million? While I was stressing over rent and skipping meals, there had been a fortune in my name. Edward's jaw tightened. And yet, from Maya's reaction, she was never informed of this. "No," Stanley confirmed. His eyes flicked to my parents. They were instructed to disclose it when she turned 18. Clearly they did not. My chest was burning. "Wait, you're saying all this time I had a trust fund? And they knew?" Stanley nodded. "Yes. In addition, 2 years ago a property was purchased, a corner apartment in Lakeside Tower, using funds from the trust. It was to be transferred to your ownership." Edward looked directly at me. "That's the apartment I asked about." I shook my head, voice cracking. "I've never even heard of this apartment." The silence that followed was brutal. Edward turned, very slowly, to my parents. His voice dropped to something that made my skin crawl. "Then where did the money go?" My dad finally spoke, voice trembling. "Edward, it's not what you think." "Don't." Edward cut him off. His tone was sharp steel. "Stanley, show her the withdrawals." Papers slid across the table. My eyes blurred, scanning them. Transfers, withdrawals, investments, my parents' names on everything, and the bottom line of over $8 million, barely 300,000 remained. I couldn't breathe. You let me drown in student loans. You watched me lose sleep over bills. And you had all this? My voice cracked, but I didn't care. My mom whispered, "We were going to pay it back." Pay it back? My voice shook. You remodeled the kitchen. You bought new cars. You went on vacations. That wasn't your money. Edward's hand settled on my arm, grounding me. "Leah," he said evenly, "freeze their accounts. Now." Leah tapped her tablet. Efficient, cold. My dad lurched forward. "Edward, please. This is a family matter." "No," Edward snapped. "This is theft. At this scale, it's criminal." My mom reached across the table for my hand, sobbing. I pulled away. Don't touch me." Edward didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Detective Ramirez will be here shortly. In the meantime, no one leaves this table." And just like that, everything I thought I knew about my life collapsed. When I finally got back to my apartment that night, Kara took one look at me and knew something was wrong. I must have looked like a ghost. She didn't press, just wrapped a blanket around me and waited until I could get words out. "My parents stole $8 million from me," I said, the words tasting ridiculous even as they left my mouth. Once I started, I couldn't stop. It all spilled out. The trust fund I never knew existed, the apartment that was supposed to be mine, the confrontation at the restaurant. Kara listened, wide-eyed, her hand gripping mine, while I cycled between shaking, crying, and going completely numb. I told her about the ramen dinners, the months I applied for food stamps, the nights I laid awake wondering how I'd cover rent, all while my parents were sipping cocktails by the pool of a house they'd bought with my money. My phone buzzed non-stop that night. Calls, texts, voicemails. My mom's voice breaking, begging me to pick up. My dad trying to sound calm, asking to talk this through. I blocked them both. The only message I answered was Edward's. "Are you safe? Do you need anything?" The next morning, Leah called with updates. The legal team had already uncovered receipts, properties in Florida, luxury cars, jewelry, business investments that had tanked, all of it funded by my trust. "Roughly 300,000 remains," she said flatly. "The rest is gone." Gone. It didn't feel real. 3 days later, Edward's team found proof my parents had purchased tickets to Panama, one way, booked before my birthday. They had been planning to leave right after the dinner, after one last performance playing the perfect parents. If Edward hadn't shown up, they would have vanished. That revelation made me sick. They hadn't just stolen, they were ready to run. Word spread through the family fast. My dad's brothers defended him, claiming Edward was overreacting. My mom's side split. Her sister called me crying, apologizing for what her sister had done. The biggest surprise was Claire. She showed up at my apartment one afternoon, dressed down for once, no designer labels or glossy Instagram vibe. She sat awkwardly on my couch and said, "I always wondered how your parents lived like that when Dad said our trusts were basically the same. Guess now we know." I stared at her, still raw from everything. She twisted her hands together. "I thought you had the best of both worlds. Parents who adored you and money you were just humble about. I never imagined this." For the first time, I saw her differently. Not the spoiled cousin showing off on social media, but another person caught in the web of family expectations and lies. That was the beginning of something unexpected, an actual friendship. Meanwhile, the legal grind didn't stop. Edward's attorneys worked like machines. Accounts were frozen, assets seized. Both the Florida house and my parents' main home were flagged, purchased with my money. Cars, boats, jewelry catalogued for liquidation. My parents' messages grew desperate. My dad called from hotel rooms saying they had nowhere to stay. My mom emailed paragraphs about how everything we did was for your benefit. None of it made sense. Then the media caught wind. A small business journal ran a piece about a prominent real estate family facing internal financial disputes. They didn't name me, but anyone who knew us could connect the dots. My stomach dropped when old acquaintances started messaging me, fishing for gossip. I deleted my socials the next day. Still, the worst part wasn't the public exposure. It was the private guilt that clung to me like smoke. Was I overreacting by letting Edward's team go so hard on them? Should I have noticed sooner? Shouldn't a daughter protect her parents, not prosecute them? My therapist, yes, Edward hired me one immediately, told me that was classic victim guilt, that betrayal by parents scrambles the brain because the people you're supposed to trust most become the ones who cut. It made sense in theory, but it didn't make sleeping any easier. The mediation felt like walking into an execution chamber. Edward's attorney's office was a sleek skyscraper downtown, all glass walls and polished floors. They put us in a conference room so big the six of us looked like ants around the table. Edward sat at my side like a fortress, with Stanley and two other lawyers lined up next to him. My parents shuffled in late with one nervous-looking lawyer who already seemed outmatched. They looked different. My dad had dark circles under his eyes, his suit hanging off him like it didn't fit anymore. My mom's hands trembled as she clutched a plain handbag. Gone were the flashy outfits, the confidence. They looked small. The forensic team laid it out in brutal detail. Graphs, timelines, charts. It started small, borrowing a little from the trust, then more. Then it snowballed into vacations, cars, renovations, my mom's failed real estate venture, my dad's idiotic day trading. 7 years of siphoning until nearly all $8.3 million was drained. Each slide hit like a punch. By the time they got to the part about them renting out the Gold Coast apartment, my apartment for their own income, I thought I might actually throw up. When the presentation ended, Edward turned slowly to my parents. His voice was calm but lethal. The accounting is complete. We know exactly where every dollar went. The only question left is whether this proceeds as a civil matter or a criminal one. Their lawyer cleared his throat. My clients understand the seriousness of their actions. They wish to cooperate, to make amends. Amends? I cut in, my voice shaking but sharp. You stole my future. You let me think I was drowning while you remodeled your kitchen. You let me cry over bills while you flew to Florida for vacations. And now you want to call that amends? My dad looked at me for the first time, eyes red. Maya, we never meant for it to go this far. At first it was just borrowing a little to get through tough months. Then it became easier to justify taking more. We told ourselves we deserved it for raising you, for the sacrifices we made. I slammed my hand on the table. Sacrifices? I was working 2 jobs in college while you bought a new Mercedes. My mom's voice cracked. We thought we'd pay it back before you ever knew. We thought it was temporary. Edward's hand landed on my shoulder, steadying me. He faced them squarely. Here are your options. Option 1, you cooperate completely. Sign over every asset purchased with stolen money. Agree to repayment on the rest. In exchange, Maya does not press charges. Option 2, we file criminal charges tomorrow. Fraud, embezzlement, theft. The evidence is ironclad. You will go to prison. They didn't even hesitate. Option 1, my father blurted. My mother nodded frantically, tears streaking her face. Then Edward looked at me. Maya, the decision is yours. I stared at them, these people who had tucked me into bed, kissed my scraped knees, clapped at my graduation, the same people who had lied to me, stolen from me, and planned to flee the country without looking back. My chest ached from the weight of it. I don't want them in prison, I finally said, my voice hoarse, but I want every cent recovered, and I want them to admit what they did. To me, to family. So we spent hours signing papers. They handed over the Florida house, their main home, cars, jewelry. Everything was cataloged for liquidation. By the end of the day, I legally owned their house in Florida, soon to be sold, with proceeds directed back into my account. When the lawyers left to make copies, it was just me and them for the first time in weeks. Why, I asked. My voice came out quieter than I expected. Why would you do this to me? My mom reached across the table, and this time I didn't pull away. We got caught up in a lifestyle we couldn't actually afford. Your dad made bad investments, and we were always behind. When we saw the trust, it felt like an easy solution. Just a little here and there, but it snowballed. We couldn't stop. My dad dropped his gaze. We have a problem with money, with status, with spending. We need help. It doesn't excuse what we did, but it's the truth. It wasn't enough. Nothing they said could undo the years I'd spent scraping by while they lived large off my money. But it was the first time they'd admitted it out loud, and that mattered. A little. The weeks after mediation felt like living in someone else's life. One day I was broke, sharing a shabby 2-bedroom with Kara and stressing over ramen dinners. The next, lawyers were transferring deeds and liquidating assets into my name. When it was all tallied, the recovered funds came to just over a fraction of what should have been mine, but still more money than I had ever imagined actually holding. Edward insisted I find a place of my own right away, not the flashy Gold Coast apartment. They'd rented that out, and it was already tied up in legal fallout, but something modest, secure, and clean. He came with me to viewings, his sharp eyes catching details I'd never think to check. Within 2 weeks I signed for a small 1-bedroom in a safe neighborhood near public transit. No mortgage, no rent, mine, free and clear. The first night I slept there, surrounded by boxes and silence, I cried. Not because I was sad, but because for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't living on borrowed time. Edward didn't stop there. He set me up with financial advisors, walked me through investments, and drilled me on budgeting like it was boot camp. Security first, he said, then growth. For a man who had spent his life building empires, he was surprisingly patient, explaining things until I understood. Leah surprised me too. At first I thought she was just Edward's shadow, efficient, cold, all business, but over late nights, sorting paperwork and strategy sessions, she opened up. She'd been working with him for over 15 years, knew his quirks, his strengths, even his regrets. She became someone I could actually lean on, not just professionally, but personally, almost like an older sister I never had. And then there was Claire. What started as awkward conversations on my couch turned into something resembling friendship. Without the Instagram filters and showboating, she was just another cousin trying to make sense of the wreckage. She admitted her jealousy, how she'd always thought I had the perfect family. That lie had shattered for both of us. Oddly enough, our shared mess brought us closer than we'd ever been. The biggest curveball was Aaron, a college friend I hadn't seen in years, who bumped into me at a coffee shop near my new apartment. We caught up, and it felt easy. No family drama hanging over us, no ulterior motives, just two people who used to stay up until 2 a.m. cramming for finals, now talking about real jobs and adult problems. Dinner turned into more dinners. Conversations turned into late-night walks. And one night, when he kissed me by the lake, it felt like a part of my life untouched by betrayal was finally opening up. Meanwhile, I was building something for myself. With the stability of the recovered funds, I started a side business, graphic design consulting for small startups that couldn't afford big agencies. Edward guided me on contracts and negotiations. Leah connected me with people who needed branding. For once, I wasn't scrambling. I was creating, and I wanted to give back. Using part of the funds, I launched a mentorship program for young designers who couldn't afford the software or training, just a few scholarships at first. But seeing someone light up because they finally had the tools to chase their passion, it gave me something money couldn't purpose. Through all of this, my parents hovered on the edges, stripped of everything they once flaunted. They moved into a small rental apartment. My dad took a lower-level insurance job. My mom ended up as an administrative assistant. Therapy became court-mandated, and they stuck with it, though I kept them at arm's length. Phone calls only, no visits. Some nights, when anger bubbled up again, I thought about how they had stolen not just money, but years of my life, years of fear and struggle that could have been avoided. But then I looked, rode at what I was building now, my apartment, my work, the circle of people who had chosen to stand beside me. And I realized the betrayal didn't define me anymore. I was writing my own story. 6 months after my birthday, Edward called it a half birthday and insisted on a dinner, not at some over-the-top palace of a restaurant, but in a private dining room he dared, filled only with people who mattered now. Leah was there. Claire came, too, quieter than I'd ever seen her, no longer projecting the trust fund princess image she used to wear like armor. Aaron sat beside me, his hand mine under the table, and Edward, still sharp, though slower these days, raised a glass. 6 months ago, he said, voice steady, your life was cracked open. Tonight we celebrate not what was stolen, but what you've built. He handed me a small box. Inside was a deed and a key to a modest apartment he'd purchased with some of the recovered funds. Not the Gold Coast place tainted by lies, he. This one is yours. A clean I cried, not for the property, but because it symbolized something I hadn't realized I needed, a break from the shadow of what should have been mine. This was new and wholly mine. By the 1-year mark, my life looked nothing like it had before. My consulting business had grown so fast, I'd hired 2 junior designers and a manager to handle the admin work I hated. The mentorship program expanded to 5 scholarships. Watching young designers find their footing filled me with a satisfaction I couldn't compare to anything. Edward's health wavered, first a warning from his doctor about blood pressure, then a brief hospitalization in the fall. Sitting beside his hospital bed, I saw a softer version of him, one who admitted regrets. He told me about my grandmother, about mistakes he'd made with my mother, about how money had always been both his gift and his curse. It didn't excuse what my parents did, but it gave me context, a chain of choices and wounds stretching back generations. My parents, they were different too. Therapy stripped them down. They sold off the last of their luxury and learned to live small. I agreed to coffee meetings once a month. It wasn't forgiveness, not fully, but it wasn't silence anymore either. They admitted their addiction to money, to status, and they were finally saying the words out loud instead of hiding behind shiny cars and remodeled kitchens. For me, the biggest shift was internal. I no longer flinched when opening my bank app. I didn't panic over grocery bills or late fees. I had savings, investments, and security for the first time ever. But more than that, I had a chosen family, Edward mentoring me with brutal honesty, Leah watching my back, Claire turning into a true friend, Aaron grounding me in something real. On the exact anniversary, I hosted a dinner in my apartment. Nothing extravagant, homemade food, mismatched plates, laughter echoing off walls. I had painted myself. Edward sat at the head of the table, realer than I wanted to admit, but smiling, Claire toasted to truth. Aaron squeezed my hand. Leah smirked like she always did when she was proud, but wouldn't admit it. And my parents? They weren't there. Not because I'd banned them, but because they knew this milestone wasn't theirs to share. When everyone left, Aaron stayed behind to help me with dishes. The apartment was quiet except for the clink of plates and the hum of the fridge. A year ago, I thought my life was over. Now I knew better. Betrayal had broken me. Yes, but it had also forced me to rebuild on something stronger. I raised my glass earlier that night and said it out loud. When the foundation is revealed to be false, you get the chance to build something true. And that's what I was doing. The betrayal would always be a chapter in my story, but it wouldn't be the defining one. By the time the seasons shifted again, I had started to settle into a new rhythm. But settling didn't mean peace. There were nights I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my chest tight, heart racing. In the dream I was always back in that restaurant, the chandeliers overhead, my grandfather's calm but heavy voice asking, "Is the apartment comfortable?" And me frozen saying, "What apartment?" only to feel the room collapse under the weight of his next words. Then where did the money go? That moment lived in me. It replayed when I brushed my teeth, when I rode the train to work, when I sat down to design a logo for a client. Sometimes it was just a flicker. Other times, it was like a ghost sitting across the table from me. Therapy helped, journaling helped, but scars don't vanish because you talk about them. They linger, even when you learn to live around them. Edward could see it. He never pushed, but he had a way of watching me like he could tell what was running through my head. He'd invite me over for dinner in his penthouse, just the two of us, his chef dismissed for the evening. Sometimes we barely talked about the betrayal at all. Instead, he'd walk me through investments, or the structure of a business deal, or even his regrets about how he raised my mother. He was getting older and weaker. Another health scare had landed him in the hospital for 3 nights. He pretended it was nothing, but I saw the way Leah hovered, more protective than ever. The man who once strode into any room like he owned it now tired just from walking across a living room. And yet, even in his frailty, he gave me lessons I'll never forget. One night, after pouring himself half a glass of wine he barely touched, he looked at me and said, "You can rebuild wealth, Maya. Money is a tide. It goes, it comes back. But trust, once it's broken, the best you can do is salvage what's left and build something new from the rubble. It never goes back to what it was." It wasn't advice. It was a warning. Meanwhile, my parents tried to inch their way back into my life. Monthly coffees at neutral cafes became routine. At first I hated it, hated the way my mother stirred her cheap latte with trembling hands, or the way my father smiled nervously, as if pretending we were just an ordinary family catching up. They look different now. My mother's designer bags and polished outfits were gone. She wore department store sweaters, her hair tied back with drugstore clips. My father had sold his watches, his shoes were scuffed, his once perfect posture slouched. They spoke softer, like they'd been stripped down to something raw. I listened. Sometimes they told me about therapy, about how they were learning to live with less, how they were budgeting with envelopes like college students, how they were ashamed of what they'd done not just to me but to themselves. My dad admitted he still woke up some nights, convinced he was in his old house, only to find himself in their cramped rental. My mom said she'd stopped looking at real estate listings altogether. I didn't forgive them. Not yet, maybe not ever. But hate takes energy, and I was tired. The anger that once boiled in me was cooling into something heavier, disappointment. A dull ache that didn't flare as much, but never quite went away. Aaron became my anchor. He didn't treat me like I was fragile, but he also never minimized what had happened. When nightmares shook me awake, he'd just pull me closer until my breathing steadied, and I doubted myself. He reminded me of what I'd already survived. When I was too deep in my head, he'd drag me out for a late-night walk or convince me to try a new recipe in the kitchen. With him, things felt normal, simple, not a performance, not a facade, just two people building something real. And that's when it hit me. The betrayal had almost destroyed me, but it also stripped everything fake away. What I was left with was real. Painful, yes, but real. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was choosing who I let in, choosing what I built, choosing who I wanted to be. And for the first time in a long time, those choices felt like mine. The mentorship program started as a small idea, almost an afterthought. Just me wanting to help a few young designers who couldn't afford the software or courses that had nearly bankrupted me. I set aside a chunk of the recovered money and figured I'd sponsor one or two scholarships. But word spread. Emails started trickling in. Stories from kids working 2 jobs, using cracked versions of Photoshop, borrowing laptops from friends just to keep up with assignments. I saw myself in every message, so I expanded. 2 scholarships became 5, then 10. I brought in guest speakers, friends of Edward's industry professionals. Leah knew. What shocked me most was how much joy it gave me, seeing their portfolios evolve, their confidence grow. It was the first time I felt like the betrayal had turned into something bigger than just my survival. Edward noticed. One night, after another long session where he taught me about scaling a business, he leaned back in his chair and said, "You're not just rebuilding yourself, Maya. You're building a legacy, one you control, one no one can take from you." I didn't realize it then, but he was preparing me for a world where he wouldn't always be there to shield me. Because Edward was fading, slowly, but noticeably. His steps were shorter, his naps longer. There were moments when his hand trembled holding a pen. Leah hovered constantly, scheduling doctor's appointments, guessing over his meals. He brushed it off, but I could see it, the clock ticking louder with each passing day. My parents, meanwhile, kept trying to earn back ground. They never asked for money. Maybe because Edward's team had eyes on them 24/7, maybe because they finally understood that door was closed. Instead, they offered small things. My mom baked me bread once, nervous as she handed it over. My dad forwarded job postings he thought might interest me, even though I no longer needed them. It was awkward, and sometimes painful, but part of me saw the cracks forming into something like humility. They weren't the people they had been a year ago, draped in luxury, smug in their lies. They were quieter, smaller, maybe even learning. Still, every time I looked at them, I remembered ramen dinners and eviction scares while they drank champagne in a house I had unknowingly paid for. Forgiveness wasn't coming easy. Aaron was the one who kept me balanced. He didn't say much about my parents, never tried to push me one way or the other, but he always reminded me that boundaries were mine to set, that I didn't owe them anything, not access, not time, not grace. If I chose to give those things, it had to be on my terms. One night we were walking home along the lake, the air cold, our breaths visible. He stopped, looked at me and said, "You know what's crazy? They stole millions from you, but somehow you came out richer, not just in money, in everything." For once I didn't argue, because I felt it too. The betrayal had shattered my foundation, but from those broken pieces, I was building something solid, something mine. And even as Edward's health wavered, even as my parents hovered in the background, even as doubt still clawed at me some nights, I knew this wasn't the end of my story. It was only the beginning. Edward's decline didn't happen all at once. It was slow, the kind of slow you almost convince yourself isn't happening until one day it's undeniable. At first it was little things. He'd lose his train of thought mid-sentence. something I had never seen from him. Or he'd stand up from his chair and steady himself on the table for a moment longer than usual. He brushed it off, joked about getting old, but Leah's eyes told the truth. Then came the hospital stays. First just overnight, then a weekend, then nearly a week. High blood pressure, complications. The doctors never sugar-coated it, but Edward refused to act like a patient. He'd sit in that hospital bed with financial statements spread across his lap, lecturing me on portfolio diversification, while nurses adjusted his IV drip. One evening, when the room had gone quiet and Leah finally left to get coffee, he looked at me and said, "I should have done better by your mother." The words caught me off guard. I started to protest, but he shook his head. "No, I mean it. I made her who she is. I built her into someone who measured life by houses and cars, because that's all I ever showed her. Maybe if I'd raised her differently, she wouldn't have done what she did to you." I didn't know how to respond. I wanted to tell him it wasn't his fault, that my parents made their own choices. But deep down, I knew he wasn't entirely wrong. The roots of betrayal often grow in soil we don't see. Still, I told him the only thing I could. "You did better by me." He smiled faintly. "Not enough, but I'm glad I lived long enough to try." After that conversation, something shifted. I started recording little things during our dinners, his stories, his advice, even the way he spoke about my grandmother, who I barely remembered. It felt urgent, like I needed to capture pieces of him before they slipped away. Meanwhile, life outside of Edward's decline kept moving. The mentorship program grew faster than I expected. We held our first showcase, students presenting their projects in front of a small panel of professionals. Aaron was at the showcase too, sitting in the back, clapping louder than anyone. Afterward, he pulled me aside. "You know you're changing people's lives, right?" I shrugged, overwhelmed. "I'm just trying to give them what I wish I'd had." He looked at me like I didn't get it. "That's exactly why it matters." As proud as I was, there was always a shadow. Edward's health, my parents' fragile attempts at change, the gnawing uncertainty of what would come next. Because no matter how much progress I made, the truth lingered. The people who were supposed to protect me had nearly destroyed me, and the man who stepped in to save me wasn't going to be here forever. That knowledge sat heavy. Every dinner, every lesson, every laugh with Edward felt like it could be the last. And I wasn't ready to say goodbye. The winter, Edward didn't bounce back. He caught what should have been a simple cold, but for him it spiraled. Pneumonia, the doctor said. His body was too tired to fight it off the way it once could. I visited the hospital every day. Leah practically lived there, pacing hallways with her phone glued to her ear, coordinating with doctors, lawyers, family. Claire came too, quieter than usual, her presence almost tossing. Aaron never asked if I wanted him there. He just showed up, holding my hand through hours of sterile waiting rooms. Edward hated the weakness. Even hooked up to oxygen, he tried to maintain control. He'd wave away nurses and ask me about my clients, my mentorship program, my apartment. "Tell me something good," he'd demand, as if refusing to let the conversation turn to his body failing him. One night, when it was just the two of us, he reached for my hand. His grip was weaker than I remembered, but his eyes were sharp, focused. "Maya, listen carefully," he said. "You are not defined by what was stolen from you. You are defined by what you build with what's left." I nodded, tears stinging my eyes. He squeezed my hand harder. "I've seen empires rise and fall. Money is fragile, but your mind, your grit, that's unshakable. Don't forget that when I'm gone." I wanted to tell him not to talk like that, to fight harder, to stay, but the truth was written all over him. He was slipping. He passed 2 weeks later, quietly in his sleep. Leah was the one who called me that morning, her voice flat but trembling at the edges. The funeral was small but heavy. Business titans, distant relatives, even people I didn't know lined up to pay respects. But all I saw was the casket and the man inside it who had been more of a father to me in 1 year than my own dad had in a lifetime. My parents came. They stood off to the side, not drawing attention, their faces drawn and hollow. I didn't approach them, not that day. After the service, Leah handed me a letter. Edward had written it weeks earlier. Inside was a simple note. Maya, I couldn't protect you from everything, but I could give you the tools to protect yourself. Keep building, keep teaching, keep choosing truth. I folded it carefully and tucked it into my bag, knowing it would never leave me. In the weeks that followed, the silence was crushing. No weekly dinners, no sharp advice over a glass of wine, no lectures disguised as conversations, just quiet. But Edward had been right. I wasn't left empty-handed. He'd left me with knowledge, with resources, with belief in myself I'd never had before, and maybe most importantly, with. Leah checked in constantly. Claire became a steady friend. Aaron held me together when I wanted to collapse. The betrayal of my parents had broken me. Edward's loss nearly did too, but somewhere inside the wreckage, I realized I was still standing. And this time, I wasn't standing alone. After Edward's funeral, life felt like it had been hollowed out. For weeks, I kept expecting my phone to buzz with his name, expecting to hear his sharp voice asking me if I'd loaded my budget again, or if I was still wasting too much money on takeout coffee. The silence was brutal. Leah became my lifeline. She had lost him too, though in a different way. For 15 years, she'd worked by his side, finishing his sentences, anticipating his needs. Now she was untethered. We started meeting once a week, not for strategy sessions or legal updates anymore, but just to talk. Claire surprised me the most. The cousin who once seemed to exist just to flaunt what I didn't have was suddenly sitting across from me at my kitchen table, helping me plan the next mentorship showcase. It feels better to actually do something with money instead of just posting about it, she admitted one night, and I realized she wasn't the same person either. My parents were still there too, hovering on the edges. The funeral had rattled them, seeing Edward lowered into the ground, the man they had betrayed and depended on. They called more often, always cautious, like they were afraid one wrong word would make me hang up. When I finally agreed to another coffee meeting, they looked different, not just in clothes or jewelry, but in posture. My dad's shoulders hunched, my mom's hands restless, twisting napkins, until they weren't proud anymore. They weren't defensive. They were just. My mom said, "We know we may never be forgiven, but we want to be better. Even if it's too late for us, we're trying." For the first time, I believed her. Not enough to erase anything, but enough to nod instead of walking out. Meanwhile, my work was exploding. The consulting firm I started as a side hustle had doubled in clients. I hired 2 more designers. Leah, who swore she was retired from babysitting rich men, agreed to come on part-time as an advisor. She had connections I never dreamed of, and under her guidance, doors opened I hadn't even knocked on. The mentorship program grew too. What started as 5 scholarships turned into a structured foundation. We had sponsors, a board, even press coverage. At the latest showcase, one of the students announced she'd landed their first paid design job. The entire room erupted in applause, and I cried harder than she did. Aaron stayed steady through it all. He didn't care about the money, the foundation, the headlines. He cared about me remembering to eat when I got lost in work, about dragging me out for walks, about reminding me to live in the present instead of obsessing over the past. One night, sitting on my apartment floor, surrounded by boxes of files and sketchbooks, he looked at me and said, "You know you've already done what Edward wanted, right? You've built something of your own, something no one can steal. And I realized he was right. Edward's voice still echoed in my head. You are not defined by what was stolen from you. You are defined by what you build with what's left. For the first time, I wasn't just rebuilding from rubble, I was building forward. The betrayal would always be part of my story. Edward's death, too. But they weren't weights anymore. They were fuel. And this time the foundation under me wasn't a lie. It was mine. Spring came again, the second since my birthday collapsed everything I thought I knew. By then, the sharp edges of grief had dulled into something I could carry. The betrayal wasn't fresh anymore, and Edward's absence wasn't a gaping wound. It was a scar I touched daily, but one that no longer bled. I kept hearing his voice in my head. Keep building. So I did. The mentorship program turned into a proper foundation, with a name, a website, and a waiting list of applicants. We brought in corporate sponsors. Leah helped draft contracts, Claire organized events, and I found myself standing on stages, speaking to rooms full of people about opportunity, resilience, and design. Public speaking terrified me once, but now it felt like a way to honor what Edward had poured into me. My business grew too. What had started as a few freelance gigs became a full studio with employees, clients across the country, and projects big enough to make me nervous, and then proud when we pulled them off. Through it all, Aaron remained steady, not flashy, not trying to fix me, just there. When I came home, drained from 12-hour days, he'd be in my kitchen making dinner. When I doubted myself, he'd remind me how far I'd come. One night, as we walked home from a showcase, he stopped mid-step and said, I don't think Edward would have trusted anyone with you if he didn't think they were worthy. I hope I prove him right. I didn't answer with words. I just kissed him. My parents remained on the edges. They were still in therapy, still living small. Our contact was careful. Monthly lunches in public places. No big reunions. No pretending things were normal. Sometimes we sat in silence. Sometimes they apologized again in new words from new angles. I never rushed to reassure them. I let the silence speak for itself. Forgiveness wasn't a destination. It was a process. One I wasn't sure I'd ever finish. But at least the hatred wasn't eating me alive anymore. On the anniversary of Edward's death, I visited his grave. The sky was gray. The air damp. I stood there with fresh flowers in my hand, and I spoke to the stone like he was sitting in one of his suits across the table from me. I'm still building, I whispered. I'm not done. And in that moment, I realized I wasn't just surviving anymore. I wasn't even just rebuilding. I was creating something entirely new, something stronger than anything I had before the betrayal, before the collapse. I fear the lies. What was stolen from me would never come back. But what I was building in its place was mine, and it was real. For the first time in years, I wasn't looking backward. I was looking forward. That's how my story ends. Not with the money that was stolen, not with the betrayal that almost broke me, but with the truth I built from the ashes. I learned that wealth can vanish overnight, trust can shatter in an instant, but resilience is something no one can take from you. And if you've stayed with me this far, I want to leave you with this. You are not what was taken from you. You are what you choose to build after. If this story resonated with you, let me know in the comments. Have you ever had to rebuild after someone you trusted betrayed you? And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Because sometimes the worst betrayal is what pushes you to create your truest beginning.